I'm Mary Yang. I'm a trial attorney at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, here in my personal capacity as Assistant VP of Programs for APABA DC. We are recording this evening's panel so we can make the recording available on our YouTube channel after the event for folks who weren't able to join us. APABA DC is immeasurably excited to put on this program on criminal justice reform that is part of APABA DC series to highlight progressive prosecutors, and to be joined by two attorneys general who are leading the charge to underscore the dignity of citizens and protect the rights of citizens across the country. Thanks to our President Erica Lai and Vice President of Education Lloyd Liu for helping make this night's event possible, and to our sponsors, I will put in the chat box, to Diya TV for broadcasting this event and providing IT support, and to our fantastic panelists who I'll introduce very soon, and of course, thanks to everyone for tuning in. APABA DC is the oldest Asian American bar association in the DC area. Our three-part mission is simple. Since 1981, we've aimed to serve as a voice for the APA legal community, elevate and promote the advancement of our members, facilitate opportunities to give back and collaborate with other community organizations. And you can learn more about our bar and join us at apaba-dc.org. For those who may be interested, on June 10th, APABA DC will be hosting another part of our Progressive Prosecutors and Criminal Justice Reform series, featuring progressive DAs, with Parisa Degani-Tofty, the Commonwealth's Attorney for Arlington County and the City of Falls Church, and Larry Krasner, District Attorney of Philadelphia. I'll put the registration information in the chat box. Tonight's event couldn't be more critical and necessary. In the wake of the trial condemning the murder of George Floyd, there was both a collective sigh of relief that justice was on the right side this time, and also feeling that much more is required in terms of police accountability, especially in relation to our Black and Brown communities. And of course, against the backdrop of the pandemic, sadly, we are also witnesses to the rise of AAPI hate, which is not new. Turning to tonight's panel, we'll be focusing on how state attorneys general are, as the top legal advisors and chief law enforcement officers of their respective jurisdictions, at the intersection of law and policy, uniquely positioned to confront the most pressing issues faced by citizens. We'll ask our esteemed panelists how they've utilized their roles to deliberate and launch progressive policies in several key areas, including police accountability, combating hate crimes and extremism, including reporting requirements. I'll keep the intros of our fantastic panelists short so we can have more time with them for the topics at hand. Karl Racine is the first elected AG of DC, inaugurated in 2014. The breadth of his experience is expansive, which includes representing indigent residents while in the DC Public Defender Service, serving as Associate White House Counsel in the first Clinton administration, and practicing white-collar and commercial litigation at leading law firms. While at Venable, he was the first African-American managing partner of a top 100 US law firm, leading over 600 lawyers. And he also served on the District Judicial Nomination Commission. Currently, he is the president of the National Association of Attorneys General. Gurbir Grewal became the 61st AG of New Jersey on January 16, 2018, upon his nomination by then Governor Murphy and confirmation by the New Jersey Senate. He started his career off in private practice, but soon served as an assistant U.S. attorney in the criminal division of the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York from 2004 to 2007, where he was ultimately assigned to the Business and Securities Fraud Unit. AG Grewal subsequently worked as an AUSA in the criminal division of the United States Attorney's Office for the District of New Jersey, where he served as chief of the Economic Crimes Unit from 2014 to 2016, and oversaw the investigation and prosecution of all major white-collar and cyber crimes in the District of New Jersey. Thereafter, he served as Bergen County Prosecutor, the chief law enforcement officer of the most populous county in New Jersey, and home to nearly 1 million residents living in 70 municipalities. Tonight's panel will be moderated by APABA DC's Assistant VP for Education, James Billings-Kong, and Associate Safer Shaw, who litigates commercial matters throughout the country. When James started his legal career over a decade ago at Venable, Attorney General Racine was the managing partner of the firm. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, James.
Thanks so much, Mary. And I'll have to mention that as a fun fact, Attorney General Racine and I were bocce partners.
That's
in the
right.
summer of 2007. So, our relationship goes beyond the legal relationship. So I'll have to apologize to you in advance if I call you by your first name, Attorney General Racine.
Please feel free to, JB.
Attorney General Grewal, certainly a catalyst for this conversation was Attorney General Racine's recommendation that I reach out to you regarding your comprehensive packaging of policies aimed to limit police force. That use of force policy has now become the model for other states. Can you explain the history behind this reform and what it means and how it differs from other policies in the past?
Certainly, James, and thank you for having me, and thanks to Karl for lifting up the great work that the people in my office have been doing around issues involving police use of force. I think it's important to note that we started this hard work well before the events of last summer, and our work was sped up by what happened in Minneapolis with the killing of Mr. Floyd. But we've been working on issues centered around policing reform since day one of our administration. The work we've done around police use of force really focuses on three areas. The first thing we're doing is we're trying to help officers avoid situations where the use of force is necessary to begin with. We want our officers, through changes in training, through changes in our police academies, to shift from that warrior mentality to that guardian mentality, which we think is needed in law enforcement. I think for too long, our police academies have spent 20 weeks yelling at police officers, training them to handle stressful situations in a militaristic way. And then we've hoped that those recruits would then go out on the streets and interact with the public in a kind and nice way. And many do, but we think you have to rethink how we're training folks in the academy to make sure that we're producing guardians who show empathy when they're on the streets and not this rugged militaristic exterior. So that's part of the work we're doing. We're also implementing statewide early warning systems to make sure we flag at-risk officers early and intervene to address problematic behavior, retrain where we can, hold accountable where we must, prosecute where necessary. So that's really the first bucket, that we're helping avoid those situations where force is used. The second bucket is that we're banning all forms of physical force except as an absolute last resort, and only after attempts to de-escalate the situation. We're helping officers identify signs of mental illness to more appropriately respond to individuals who might be going through a mental health crisis, and giving officers additional tools in their toolkit to bring those situations to safe resolution. Importantly, to the events of last summer, we're also establishing an affirmative duty to intervene. We've required that every law enforcement officer in our state, if they see a fellow officer using force in an improper way, in an excessive way, has a duty to intervene. That if they violate that duty, they will be held accountable. But importantly, we're training them on how to intervene and how to be active bystanders. And we're borrowing from Georgetown University's ABLE program, Active Bystandership for Law Enforcement, to give them these critical skills. And then the third area of our work is in those rare cases where force is used, we're reviewing each and every use of force. And we're sharing information about those uses of force publicly because we think accountability requires transparency. So we're making our use of force reports available through a portal that's available online so citizens can play a role in these accountability efforts. And if you go to our website, njoag.gov/force, you'll see the links to this beta portal. And it's an important tool. But that online reporting also must be reviewed by supervisors to make sure, again, we're addressing problematic behavior, we're correcting those officers who might be crossing the line. And the upshot of all of this is that we're rethinking that the police-citizen interaction, that we're demanding better outcomes, we're giving officers the tools to achieve those better outcomes, and where they may cross the line, we're putting in place accountability measures because we don't want to see those scenes that we saw play out in Minneapolis play out in our state.
And Attorney General Racine, as a district's AG and the president of NAG, Certainly, you've been canvassing the country and sounding the alarm in promotion of Attorney General Grewal's sweeping reform. Do you find that others are being receptive? Are they pushing back? What has it been like?
That's a very interesting question. Let me first just say thank you, Apaba, for having me tonight, joined by my really great friend and a lawyer who I have tremendous respect for in Attorney General Grewal. First, let me comment that I really think the New Jersey model is the most comprehensive, well thought out, clearest and most transparent model for police reform in the country. And having studied it for a long time, I became an acolyte. I felt as though it was my responsibility to try as best I could to assist General Grewal in promoting the extraordinary work that New Jersey has done. Part of the problem is that when we see these flashpoints, these killings of unarmed human beings, you oftentimes get a lot of media attention on that, calls for action, even aggressive calls to defund the police. But the hard work is rarely actually done. And that's why New Jersey and Attorney General Grewal's leadership is so significant. If you take a look at exactly what they've done in New Jersey, I think it really will mean that we don't need any more blue ribbon commissions or any task forces. We should just go to the New Jersey model and adopt the pieces that jurisdictions are ready to bring in to their police force. In regards to whether aspects of the New Jersey model are being followed, I think there's a lot of attention on New Jersey for good reason. I think unfortunately that, police reform oftentimes, just like criminal justice reform, becomes sort of a hot button political issue where people try as best they can to take sides. And they oftentimes claim that reform is anti-police. And again, that's the beauty of the New Jersey model, because the police officers, the unions, bought in, which again, I think is the way that leaders need to act going forward to kind of break the political impasse as to whether you're in favor of police or whether you're not in favor of police. That's not what it's about. It's about reform getting better and public safety, and as AG Grewal said, treating every human being the police interact with decency and humanity, and using force as a last resort.
James, can I key off of something Karl said?
Sure, please do.
I think it's important to highlight. We're having this national conversation and we're having this generational reckoning on issues of race and justice. And much of it has been prompted by the movement for Black lives in this country and sped up by the killing of George Floyd and the subsequent protests. But we have to recognize, as Karl was alluding to, that George Floyd was not a unique American tragedy. There were countless others, unfortunately, before Mr. Floyd. There have been countless others since. So I have an extreme sense of urgency, which I know that AG Racine shares, that we don't need to overthink this. We've studied the issue. We've looked at it. We don't need to spend years around commissions to figure out what the solutions are. We have proven that you can have better outcomes between law enforcement and citizens if you follow these simple steps. And the playbook we've assembled has been done collaboratively, because you can't improve police and community relations without involving the police and without involving the community. You need to bring police and community together to talk about these issues, to develop these solutions. A luxury that I have that other AGs don't is that I have the ability to do this through directives. I can issue what are called AG directives in New Jersey, which are binding on law enforcement, binding policy documents on all 535 plus police departments, 38,000 cops. So we could issue these directives and change, without going through a legislative process, without going through hearings, how police training is done, how police accountability is done, how we ensure transparency. But we have not done that unilaterally. We have brought all stakeholders together. We've engaged with police leadership, union leadership. We've engaged with the civil rights community, stakeholders, religious organizations. We had 21 public listening sessions in the midst of a pandemic, most of them virtually, online public comments portal. We took all that information and then we crafted these policies by going to the best playbooks we found across the country, assembling one playbook, which doesn't, again, apply to one police department. It applies to all police departments in my state on a statewide basis. And when we announced it on that virtual press conference, you had the head of the state PBA in the square, much like Karl is next to me on my screen. And the next square, we had the head of Noble in New Jersey. We had the ACLU lifted up. We had the NAACP of New Jersey lifted up, Salvation and Social Justice, a civil rights organization. And I think that shows you where you have the will to get this done, you can get this done with wide stakeholder input. And I think that's going to be the reason why this policy succeeds in New Jersey, and hopefully will be codified later legislatively, but it succeeds because it's been adopted universally. And you saw the benefits of this proactive approach in the wake of Mr. Floyd's killing. You had protests in other parts of the country. You had violent interactions between law enforcement and police. In my state, we had hundreds and hundreds of protests, but down in Camden, you had Chief Wysocki marching arm in arm at the head of the Black Lives Matter protest. Right across the river, you had something different in Philly, but that doesn't happen by accident. It happens because we're doing this hard work of engagement around these issues and coming up with these solutions.
And is that what you mean by culture eats policy for breakfast? Certainly AG Racine had brought up the defund the police callings. Is that all tied together, and to get this community buy-in to ensure that the policies are implemented?
Well, I mean, when I say culture eats policy for breakfast, it's not something I came up with. I heard Chief Scott Thompson, former chief in Camden, use it. And what we mean by that, and what he means by that, is that you can have the best words on paper. You can come up with the best policies. I could say, hey, I want every law enforcement officer to do A, B, and C. It doesn't mean a thing until you change culture and you change mentality and you get that buy-in of law enforcement. And the way you change culture is through changing the way officers are trained. I alluded to it earlier. It's changing the training in our academies. It's changing the in-service training. And you ensure that change through accountability and transparency measures like our use of force portal, like the fact that every use of force is reviewed within 24 hours of a use of force incident being reported. That's how you change culture. So that's what I'm alluding to in those statements that I've made, echoing that phrase that I've heard. And you also change culture. And a lot of our discussion around policing right now is on back-end accountability. You change culture by having front-end accountability. What I mean by that is ensure that you're recruiting the best. Ensure that you're weeding out those who should not be in law enforcement by having rigorous standards and rigorous psychological evaluations and rigorous scrubbing of social media history to figure out who is this person that I'm entrusting with this immense responsibility and who I'm giving this incredible power to. We have to get away from those days that, well, okay, I'm going to hire you because your dad was a cop and your dad was a cop and you know the mayor in my town. We're not doing that. We're improving and how we're filtering out those who shouldn't be in law enforcement and trying to attract the best and brightest and the most compassionate to this profession. And that's why, in my mind, the defund narrative just doesn't work. I mean, I get it. You don't want cops to respond to mental health calls, but until and unless you build out those systems where social workers can respond to that call for a man with a knife, I need to invest in training. I need to hire better. I need to give officers more tools to respond to that man with a knife and de-escalate it without using force by giving them crisis intervention team training, by giving them more training on de-escalation. So in this context of defund the police, if we could all agree on what the definition is, I need to invest better and more smartly fund law enforcement, and that's what we're doing in New Jersey.
And then, Karl, I want to highlight some of your progressive initiatives too, as well, if I can pivot here, especially in the restorative justice space, proposals by the District Task Force on Jails and Justice, which you're a part of, and the bipartisan efforts to promulgate the First Step Act. Can you get into those for our benefit?
Sure. I think it's really important to know when you're talking about what attorneys general in the United States can do for their jurisdictions, you really need to first understand what their jurisdiction and power is. And as AG Grewal outlined well, he has remarkable and broad powers, and he utilized those exceptionally well. In the District of Columbia, my powers or authority are not as broad in the criminal justice realm as AG Grewal's. So I needed to focus specifically on where it was we could get something progressive done. And so we focused our efforts where we in DC have exclusive authority, and that is in the area of juvenile justice. And so we inherited a system when I became AG where there was really a zero tolerance for papering down charges. You had to maximally paper all offenses, which means maximally charge all kids with every offense you could. You had to also seek the sternest punishment, even though the juvenile justice system is premised on rehabilitation. And so we sought to change that narrative. And that's what we did by changing the culture. And part, unfortunately, sometimes of changing culture means changing people. And so I've got to tell you that one of the first things we did was we removed certain folks who, were not going to be part of the progressive change that we were going to bring about. And so one of the areas that we really focused on was the idea that rehabilitation of kids required a different mode of operation, a different system. The adversarial system that applies in the adult realm may not be the best for young people. Imagine this: a young person commits a serious crime. He has a lawyer assigned to him. That young man immediately is going to be in that adversarial context. How do you plead? Not guilty. Sure enough, adversarial trial, putting on witnesses, cross-examination, et cetera, et cetera. Months can go by before a kid even offers an apology or a recognition of mistake or accountability. And so we really fixated on restorative justice as a means by which to empower both the victim and the offender to first recognize that the offender needed to acknowledge accountability. And then in a safe environment with trained counselors and mediators, engage in a series of conversations with the victim, where the victim actually describes in great detail all of the harm that he or she has suffered at the hands of the youthful offender. I have attended these sessions, and literally you can see the young offender realize for the first time the pain and hurt and damage that he or she has caused. And you can see empathy being developed. And then through the process, the offender and the victim come together again with trained mediators. And both offender and victim are permitted to bring in supporters. So there'll be, a person of faith for the offender. There'll be siblings or parents for the victim. And there'll be other people to help them through this kind of heart-wrenching revelatory process. And eventually, it ends with an agreement that the victim and the offender make as to how the offender will make amends. We're up to well over 200 restorative justice circles now. And I want to tell you that 97% of the victims who've gone through restorative justice tell us that they would recommend it to their best friend should that friend be a victim. And what we've also found is that the rates of recidivism on the part of the offenders have dropped significantly. And I have to tell you, I really believe, and our data strongly suggests, that the reason is is that the young people actually are developing cognitive thinking. They're starting to understand, in short, the consequences of their action and how they do cause harm and how it's their obligation to repair that harm. So restorative justice is a significant reform that we brought to the District of Columbia. And our goal, quite simply, is to make restorative justice the default process for resolving criminal issues in the DC juvenile justice system versus that of the adversarial system. I know I've talked a lot about RJ. I'll just spend a little bit more time now talking about the work that we're doing in regards to local parole boards. In DC, because we're not a state, we don't have a local parole board.
Yeah.
The parole board for DC offenders instead is the federal parole board. And the federal parole board is very disconnected from DC residents. And frankly, the decision-making is almost always guaranteed to be the harshest. So we're helping the local task force think about that. And we're recommending a process where there's community involvement. And we're recommending that judges be the ones who make the decisions on parole. Because it's sort of well understood generally that the hardest thing to ask a parole board to do is to vote for release. And the data shows, partly because of that, that's why release is rarely granted. Judges are more experienced. They're certainly more immune, if you will, from second guessing. And I think they, generally speaking, make better decisions than local parole boards. That's what we're doing in DC.
It's amazing work, amazing work. AG Grewal, you're making headlines as well for decriminalizing or seeking lower punishments for drug crimes. Can you speak on that issue? And I'm also curious about your thoughts about cash bail reform and whether that's an initiative of yours.
Sure, I'll answer the second part of your question first.
Sure.
We moved away from a cash monetary bail system to a risk-based system 4 or 5 years ago. It was a ballot measure. It was a constitutional amendment in New Jersey under Governor Christie. It's been implemented. Criminal justice reform is up and running in New Jersey for now, I think, 3 to 4 years. And it's been a remarkable success. I think, people like me from when I was a prosecutor at the county level, I started right when we were implementing our new system. And along with my fellow county prosecutors, we thought this, the sky was falling, that the world would end, that crime would go up. And guess what? None of that happened. What we did was come up with a more equitable system where you didn't have low-risk defendants on high bails, sitting in pretrial lockup for probably longer than they would serve on their sentences, finally taking a plea just to get out because they couldn't afford their bails, even low-risk defendants on low bails. And so it brought down our pretrial jail population incredibly, no corresponding uptick in crime. And now we're doing risk-based assessments for each defendant. And that's the way it should be. That's what it was in the federal system when I was a federal prosecutor. Obviously, our volume is greater in New Jersey, but we have shown that you can get it done and it does not negatively impact public safety. To your question about what we're doing on nonviolent drug offenses, in the midst of this reckoning that we're having on issues of race, one of the things that all of us have to acknowledge is that systemic racism is real. That it pervades our criminal justice system, that the history of slavery and the history of Reconstruction, the history of Jim Crow and the civil rights movement, the history of the war on drugs and mass incarceration leads to deep-seated biases in our criminal justice system. And it results in disparities in our jail populations where we have some of the worst in New Jersey, that we have more Black and brown residents incarcerated as a percentage than any other state. And so to address that, we took a real meaningful look at who were the people serving these sentences, what was the risk presented, and how we could address it. Governor Murphy convened something called a criminal sentencing disposition committee, and we did a study. And as part of that committee, I brought the county prosecutors, all 21 of our county prosecutors or district attorneys together. And I said, we've got to sign off on this. We have to support this. We have to support getting rid of mandatory minimums in New Jersey for nonviolent drug offenses. And so that recommendation was unanimous. There was legislation that the commission proposed. And in true Jersey style, you have a great social justice piece of legislation, a package of bills that would get rid of mandatory minimums for nonviolent drug offenses, for nonviolent property offenses. What does our legislature do? They said, while you were at it, why don't you get rid of these 16 mandatory minimums for public corruption offenses? Which really doesn't address racial justice issues. It wasn't looked at the committee. No one ever on that committee said we should also get rid of mandatory minimums for official misconduct, bribery, all these other white collar offenses. And they come back and say, well, we're only one of 2 states that has mandatory minimums for these offenses. It's Illinois and us. And I say for good reason. So these are tools that I need, and I use those official misconduct charges to hold law enforcement accountable. I charged 10 officers in a violent prison beating of female inmates at Naman, our female prison, using official misconduct. It's certainty. You're going to serve this sentence. And I think that's a strong deterrent message for public officials, in particular police officers, when they engage in excessive force. So that's what we've done. We had those package of bills. They added that bit about public corruption. So what I did is I said, you know what? I've got this directive authority that we talked about a moment ago. There's some court rules that allow me to waive mandatory minimums. I directed all of our prosecutors through that directive authority to prospectively waive mandatory minimums for those nonviolent drug offenses. And I said, let's use our court rules and reopen the sentencing for those thousands of inmates who are suffering because our legislature can't get their act together. And we're going to resentence them and waive the mandatory minimums in those cases. And if they've already served their time without those mandatory minimums, they'll be home, and we're going to work on a process to reintegrate them and re-enter. And if not, we'll resentence them. And so that's how, I think that's what you were alluding to. That's what we've done in New Jersey. We've done an end around. It's not a permanent fix, but it allows us to keep those other tools that we need.
Before I shift gears, I want to talk about AG Racine's Nag Initiative. But before I do, I want to encourage the audience to please send me any questions that you might have. I see a few already, and we'll certainly leave some time at the end for the AGs to consider those. Now, Karl, your Nag Initiative is very fascinating to me, especially your working with Christian Picciolini, and hopefully I'm not botching that name. And I would love to hear your working with him as well. But can you speak on this initiative that you have and why you wanted to bring it to the forefront?
Sure. So at the National Association of Attorneys General, the way it works is that every person who is elected to be president of that organization has the opportunity as president for the year in which he or she is president to put forward an initiative and essentially the room, if you will, of AG focus on that initiative and issues related thereto for 1 year. And I thought long and hard about what my initiative might be, but I got to tell you, it was an easy decision to focus on hate. And we know that hate is not anything new. We know that our country, as really extraordinary as it is imperfect, and at critical times in its history have allowed hate, hateful ideas, hateful laws to result in one group of people being treated differently than another group of people because of an immutable characteristic, right? Their race, their gender, their religion, and more recently, of course, even their sexual orientation. And so I really wanted to focus the room on an anti-hate agenda. And that's what my initiative is fundamentally about. You mentioned Christian Picciolini. Christian is a wonderful human being and a very good friend of mine now. I'm glad I didn't meet him in the 80s or in the 90s because he was a neo-Nazi member. And he hated any and everything that was not, to be honest, white, European-based, or skinhead-based. And so for Christian and his crew, and he led the crew in Chicago for over a decade, a good day was running up against a Hasidic Jew, or a Black man, or a Sikh Indian. And he would terrorize them physically, and engage in all kinds of other acts. Well, Christian, when his family decided to leave him because they got sick and tired of being around that type of individual, had an awakening. And he realized that he was, obviously off course. And in a deep book that he's written called Breaking Hate, he really broke it down, I think, in a very simple way. What he found is that so many people like him get caught up because they have lost identity, community, and purpose, and instead had those three areas of loss, identity, community, and purpose, filled by hateful groups who had given them refuge and support by becoming members of that hateful group. They've given them identity, community, and purpose, that the reason for all of your woes is because of some other group. And so Christian now, as well as others, is all about the business of really converting people one by one who've joined these hate groups into good old-fashioned loving people, not hateful people. Now, let me talk about hate just a little bit more, because I think it's incredibly important to understand that the genesis of a lot of the hate is a lack of education and a lack of awareness. And I have to tell you that, in my own initiative, I've run up against a resistance around people who don't want to be educated and don't want to make themselves aware. And we know once we're educated and once we're aware that we're less prone to scapegoat large swaths of people for problems that we may be having. And of course, we know that hate has increased dramatically over the last 5 years in terms of hateful incidents and murders. 2019 was the year of last record that had the most hate motivated murders in our history. We also know that leadership and the tone at the top is incredibly important to making education and awareness important, and scapegoating unacceptable. And we passed a period of our time, I hope, where the leader of our country is not fomenting that kind of hate and division. I want to talk just for a moment about a man called Lee Wong, who is a legislator in Cincinnati. Happens to be a Republican, I happen to be a Democrat. We asked Council Member Wong to attend our AAPI hate event that we had last week in DC, and he did. And he was an incredible speaker. Why was that? He was criticized by his colleagues in Cincinnati for bringing attention to the lack of action to protect the AAPI community in Cincinnati. And at a council hearing in Cincinnati, what he did was he took his shirt off and he showed his council members the scars that are on his body after he joined the United States Armed Forces and was severely wounded in war. I think what he really challenged people to understand is that becoming an American, being an American, doesn't have anything to do with your race, color, creed, gender, who you pray to. It has to do with what you're willing to do to fight for the principles of our country. And so that's what my initiative is about. And I really do believe, again, education, and awareness is incredibly important to stopping the shameless scapegoating that results in horrific violence in our country.
That's wonderful work, Karl. We certainly appreciate that initiative. Attorney General Grewal, certainly there are targeted attacks on the AAPI community which have proliferated all across the country. And we know that there have been nearly 4,000 hate-based crimes against the AAPI community, at least between March 2020 and February of this year. What has it been like in New Jersey? Have you responded to those? If so, how have you responded?
I mean, certainly, as Karl laid out, the trends have been going in the wrong direction for the last 5 years, and more recently, the number of attacks against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have increased across the country and in my state as well. Just as an example, we do good data collection in New Jersey. We require all of our law enforcement agencies to collect this information, to report it up. Last year was the highest number of reported bias incidents in my state. We had 1,400 reported bias incidents, and there was an increase, a significant increase in anti-AAPI hate as well. So we're tracking the rest of the country, but it comes as no surprise to AG Racine and to me, because we know that in times of national crisis or duress, that people are scapegoated and people are victimized. It so happens in the most recent moment in which we find ourselves, in the midst of COVID, coupled with the former president's rhetoric and the rhetoric of others, there has been an increase of anti-Asian violence. AAPI communities have been scapegoated, but this is, if you look back to history, I mean, this is the Page Act. This is the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is the internment of Japanese after World War II. This is how Southeast Asian refugees were treated after the Vietnam War. This is how Vincent Chin was killed in the recession of the 1980s, and the anti-Japanese sentiment. Unfortunately, he was targeted in the midst of that in Detroit. This is my own experience and the experience of other South Asians and Muslims after 9/11. In a period of national duress and crisis, there was a rise in Islamophobia and anti-South Asian violence. A Sikh American, Balbir Singh Sodhi, was killed in Mesa, Arizona, a week after 9/11. 2016, 2017, 2018, what candidate Trump did early on with the travel bans, a rise in violence against those who were brown or perceived to be Muslim. And so when he started throwing around terms like China virus and Kung flu, people like Karl, other like-minded AGs, we started ringing the alarm that we have to stop, that comments lead to conduct, and you can't do this. You can't be this irresponsible, because we've seen this throughout our history. And so we've taken steps, joining AG Racine to hold the platforms that allow this to happen accountable, the Facebooks of the world, the social media platforms. You have to do more to police your own platforms. Those algorithms that you use to profit off of people also push like-minded people together and allow bigots to find communities. So do better there. In my own state, Karl was talking about education. Our governor convened a youth bias task force, which came up with 27 transformational recommendations, not in the wake of the anti-AAPI violence, but the violence that preceded it, that years-long rise. And the crux of those recommendations focus on education, 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 a strong anti-bias curricula in our schools, a strong anti-bias curricula for teachers so they could identify this conduct. Because if we could get to our young people, we could stop them from getting on these paths. And I firmly believe, as Karl said, that we can get this right by teaching and through education. And I fall back on the words of Nelson Mandela here, who talks about hate being a learned behavior. He said, no one is born hating another person because of the color of their skin, their religion, their background, their identity. People must learn to hate. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love, because love comes much more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. And that's what we're doing in New Jersey. We're focusing on our young people through our Youth Bias Task Force and getting into our schools and pushing a strong anti-bias curriculum.
Karl, AG Grewal brings up a great point about these platforms. Are you finding difficulty behind their possibility of hiding behind Section 30 of the Communications Decency Act? Is there something to get around what seems to be a shield to protect the platforms?
Well, that's its own issue, that Section 230, and clearly there needs to be, a thorough review of it, and I'm, certainly an advocate of change there. But what we're seeing in the platforms, more often than not, is that the platforms are not even following their own policies and their own agreements with their users to not be tolerant of hate. Let me give you an example. In the 10 days right before the inauguration, right, which means right after the January 6th incident, sure enough, Facebook was putting up ads for guns, ammunition, other kind of militaristic, kind of armed gear right around where these hate groups populated. So encouraging capitalism around hate groups and profiting from it. I'm happy that a group of attorneys general wrote a letter, strong letter to Facebook, and literally within 24 hours, they took those ads down. And so the first step is certainly studying Section 230, but really it's holding them to account in regards to their own policies. I am happy to say that I'm starting to see some improvement on the part of the larger platforms. But, it only came by us and others holding their feet to the fire. And it's going to require us to continue to do just that.
And I'm curious about your thoughts on that same question, AG Grewal, on Section 230 and what you envision.
I think Karl's absolutely right that we have to take a deep and hard look at 230 and how it's being used as a shield by these social media platforms. It's really far afield from where it started. We're in a different world. These social media platforms and their algorithms drive bigots to each other, allow people to find community, allow hate to be normalized. I think that's what's important to realize here, that if somebody with these hateful ideologies went into the public square and started saying, I hate all this category of people would look at him like he was crazy and not give him anything that would normalize his beliefs. But if you do that type of search on Facebook, you'll find other groups where you could find community. So, we had a group in New Jersey called Rise Up Ocean County, an anti-Semitic group targeting the Hasidic community in Lakewood, New Jersey, and talking about an infestation of Jews coming to Lakewood and how they were taking over and how we need stronger zoning laws to keep them out. Just horrific stuff. And they were organizing on Facebook. So we used our bully pulpit, which we have as AGs, and we said to Facebook, you can't let this happen because it's having real life impact in the rise in bias offenses against Orthodox Jews in this part of my state. We pushed. Unfortunately, it took the deadliest anti-Semitic attack happening in another part of our state at the end of 2019 for them to finally take down this page. But then they resurrect. They come back in a different form, in a different group. So it's almost like a game of whack-a-mole. We are starting to see more success. I think the ADL and others who are pulling sort of the economic levers where advertisers are banding together and pulling their advertisements from these platforms unless they do more, that is helping. But 230 reform has to be part of it as well, and we're looking at it. And I will say this, we're creative. Karl's creative. AGs are creative. We come up with unique legal theories to hold people accountable. And so 230 is not an absolute barrier for us to go after these folks. And we're looking at very creative ways in my state, and I know other AGs are as well, to hold bad actors accountable, regardless of what protections may be available to them.
Well, we're a little past the 7 o'clock hour, and I apologize. That's largely in part because of the late start. So if I may have about 5 minutes, we do have a number of audience questions that I can throw at you both. I truly appreciate it. So the first question, and this may be directed to AG Grewal, is there a way, and even to Karl actually, is there a way to nationalize New Jersey's use of force policy at the congressional level?
There's not an easy way to do that because these are our state powers, right? These are local issues and local policing, decisions. And so principles of federalism would prevent that from being legislated at a national level. What the Congress can do and is doing with the George Floyd and Justice and Policing Act is trying to incentivize those jurisdictions that adopt these types of policies, including policies like ours and principles from the policies that we've implemented, and saying, hey, you'll get burn jag grant funding, or you'll get this federal grant funding if you adopt these policies, put in place these portals and databases. And so that's the way they can do it with these carrots. So they don't really have a stick to make people do it, but it's to incentivize jurisdictions to adopt these policies. I think what the administration does have is an obligation, though, to push these policies through those types of measures, because, again, Karl's seen this movie before. I've seen this movie before. There's a national tragedy. There's a commission. There are recommendations. President Obama had his task force on 21st century policing. And then what we lose is the will to get something done. I think, I read Professor Glaud's book, Begin Again, and he talks about this present moment in our country's history as being our third founding, our third opportunity to get this right, to finally address the big lie on which the country has been premised and confront these issues once and for all. And I truly think, and that's why my work, I have a sense of urgency that if we don't seize this now, when will we get this done? When will we get this done? And so I really hope they keep pushing these issues through the means that they have, and I hope other AGs who have been reaching out to us start implementing this where they can. Other legislatures follow our lead as well. So, but those are the limitations on the federal response.
Karl, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that or.
No, I think it was a comprehensive answer. My hunch is, and my prayer is, to be quite honest, more than a guess, is that New Jersey is going to achieve real, objectively verifiable results. And once those results are published, and I'm talking about in the next, few years, that other states will have no choice but to look at that best practice and start adopting it. That's my fervent hope and my fervent belief.
And we'll lead this as the final question. And thank you again for your time. As Mary mentioned, we're immeasurably excited that you both took the time out. Karl, it's always great to see you. Hopefully, I'll see you soon in person, maybe at a Wizards game like last time. But the final question: have you all studied the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act brought on by Senator Hirono, and if so, do you see that having any impact in your jurisdiction?
I have looked at it, and I do think that there are important provisions there. AG Grewal recited to you the number of hate crime incidents that were reported in New Jersey. That's a really big deal that New Jersey requires its local law enforcement officials to actually record and report out those numbers. Nationally, the state of reporting out hate incident numbers is porous. Let me give you an example. You remember in Charlottesville, where James and I went to law school, with the alt-right march, there was at least 3 murders. There was obviously Heather Heller, and 2 police officers died as a result of surveillance activities that day. And there were over 5 dozen arrests related to those hate offenses. For that year, no hate crimes were reported out of Charlottesville. And so the COVID-19 Hate Act would provide for greater funding for local law enforcement to report crimes that were COVID-19 hate related. That's the first step that needs to be achieved. And I think that's a good first step. But let me again emphasize the great need, as AG Grewal explained well and persuasively, for education. That is the key. And I got to tell you, it galls me when I see political people put up their defenses at attempts to educate our fellow citizens and residents throughout our country on the history that we have in our country of sometimes engaging in hate. It's through recognizing our potential, both good and evil, that we can make a affirmative decision to stay away from our prior misdeeds and learn from them, and instead follow a path that doesn't involve hate.
And AG Grewal, I don't know if you want to follow that up.
It's hard to follow. It's an honor to be here with AG Racine. I want to thank APABA for organizing this discussion. And I too look forward to us connecting in person again in DC and having this conversation in person. The legislation you referenced, as Karl said, is necessary. We do a lot of it, the tracking, the reporting, and we've shown how we could use that to address our education efforts, how we could use it to address our enforcement efforts. We have an online reporting system to remove barriers on reporting. So we do a lot of it. And I think, unfortunately, it's necessary for others to do the same thing. So we have a better visibility into how pervasive this problem is, so we could develop collective solutions to address it. So again, thank you for having me. It's been an honor to be here with AG Racine. I want to thank him for introducing us so we could have this conversation.
Absolutely. And thank you both again. These were incredible insights. I know a lot of notes were taken, and certainly this message will be spread. I want to thank the sponsors as well as Diya TV for broadcasting this event, and also to our amazing audience. I want to encourage you to attend our next event on progressive prosecutors. That's on June 10th. The link is in the chat. And once again, bravo to you both, Attorney General Racine and Attorney General Grewal. We appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.